yield the floor.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak on the nomination of William Barr to be the next Attorney General of the United States of America. Last Thursday, I voted against his nomination in the Senate Judiciary Committee, as did 9 of my fellow committee members. I voted against his nomination because of some very serious concerns I have with his record on everything from criminal justice to environmental justice to defending the economic rights of Americans, to the rights of immigrants, LGBTQ rights, and women's rights. And I want to go through some of those concerns here now on the floor today. But I also want to be clear that Mr. Barr has been nominated at a time of extraordinary challenge when it comes to defending rights in this country. This is a crisis because we are in a moment in history that after years of attacks on civil rights by this president and the Attorney General Jeff Sessions, some of our most fundamental democratic principles, the rule of law, separations of powers, equal protection under the law, are hanging in the balance. We now face a full-blown crisis when it comes to rolling back the rights of Americans. From community to community across the country, we see what it looks like when the Department of Justice fails to pursue justice for all Americans. It looks like hate crimes in this country on a rise for the 3rd year in a row, but a Department of Justice that rolls back protections for LGBTQ Americans instead of strengthening them. It looks like more than a third of all the LGBTQ youth in our country missing school because they feel unsafe, but a DOJ that refuses to fight for them and protect them against state laws that target transgender students. It looks like unchecked voter suppression of Black Americans in Georgia, Native Americans in North Dakota, and the voter ID and voter purge laws across this country that have targeted and tried to suppress minority voters, but yet a Justice Department that has stood by and failed to take on one single voting rights case during the last 2 years. It looks like communities that are being poisoned by corporate polluters, pushing their costs of doing business onto neighborhoods least able to defend themselves, making their land and air and water toxic. But a DOJ that has made it easier for polluters to get settlement agreements while cutting its own enforcement capacity to hold those corporate polluters accountable. And it looks like corporate malfeasance that continues to target the most vulnerable, while the DOJ enforcement of corporate penalties dropped by 90% during the first 2 years of the Trump administration. It looks like doubling down on the failed war on drugs, which has been known to be not a war on drugs, but a war on the American people. Disproportionately low-income Americans, disproportionately mentally ill Americans, disproportionately addicted Americans, and disproportionately Black and brown people, which is exactly what Jeff Sessions did when he directed all federal prosecutors to, quote, charge and pursue the most serious, readily provable offense and seek the highest penalties in nonviolent drug crimes. It looks like unarmed Black men being killed by law enforcement officers in their own homes or their own backyards, and Americans of color disproportionately being stopped, arrested, and searched without adequate systems of accountability, but having a DOJ that limits the use of consent decrees that can prevent systemic abuses of power by law enforcement that could actually help to make law enforcement better, more accountable, more effective, rebuilding and repairing the trust between law enforcement and communities necessary to create safe and strong communities. And of course, what does it look like? It looks like children fleeing violence, being ripped from the arms of their parents, of their mothers at the southern border, and 6-year-olds being thrown into cages, and an untold number of children who have still not been reunited with their families because of the DOJ's so-called zero-tolerance policy. Right now, we see a Justice Department whose leadership over the past 2 years has failed countless community after community after community. From low-income Americans who are being victimized by large corporations with bad actors, to individual Americans who are trying to have their basic fundamental rights protected. The Justice Department has failed the American people, and most of all, it's failed to seek that ideal that we all hold dear, which is equal justice under the law. That is why at this moment in history, during this crisis of conscience, during this crisis of moral leadership, we need an Attorney General who grasps the urgency of the moment, who is aware of the impact of the Department of Justice on communities across this country, and who is willing and prepared to protect our most fundamental rights in every community for every American. That's the ideal of justice. It's the ideal of patriotism. What is patriotism but love of country? You cannot love your country unless you love your fellow countrymen and women. And what does love look like in public? Justice. 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 I appreciate that Mr. Barr took time to sit down and meet with me. It was after the hearings, but yet at my request, he finally agreed to come and meet with me. There was no staff in the room. It was an honorable gesture, a gesture of courtesy, and we had a chance to have dialogue about his record, his experiences, his perspectives, as well as mine. I appreciate that. It's a constructive first step. I appreciate his willingness to listen to me and talk about his record of mass incarceration. I even appreciate his willingness to accept the book that I gave him, I hope he reads it, called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. But the concerns I had and the concerns I continue to have about Mr. Barr's ability and willingness to be the kind of Attorney General that this country needs at this pivotal moment in American history. I'm concerned because throughout his career, time and time again, and during his confirmation process, Mr. Barr has demonstrated that he not only holds troubling views, but that he has an alarming lack of knowledge about the crises that make our justice system so broken right now. At a time when the United States continues to lead the globe, to lead the planet Earth, to lead all of humanity in the sheer number of people we incarcerate, 1 out of every 4 people incarcerated on planet Earth are right here in the United States of America, the land of the free. 1 out of every 3 incarcerated women on the planet Earth are right here in America, the land of the free. And I say again, they're not the wealthy, they're not the privileged. As my friend Brian Stevenson says, we have a nation that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than poor and innocent. Overwhelming our prison population has grown since 1980 alone in this country on the federal level 800%. And you can tell a lot about a nation by who they incarcerate. In Russia, they incarcerate political prisoners. In Turkey, they incarcerate members of the media. In this country, we incarcerate the poor. We incarcerate Americans with mental illnesses, Americans with disabilities, Americans who are survivors of sexual assault, Americans who are struggling with addiction, people who have faced harm that need help, who often in the system get hurt and experience retribution and not restorative justice. We have a nation where we're locking people up for doing things that 2 of the last 3 presidents admitted to doing. Mr. Barr has a record for actively pushing the policies that have led to mass incarceration, that have driven up our nation's prison populations. At a time when we need an Attorney General that is willing to follow the lead of this body which passed criminal justice reform. When Mr. Barr served as Attorney General during the first Bush administration, he literally wrote the book on mass incarceration. He commissioned a report entitled The Case for More Incarceration. and wrote the foreword endorsing it. He is an architect of a criminal justice system that is so disproportionate, out of proportionality, that is ruthless, that is doing things that other countries up until this body acted called torture, like juvenile solitary confinement. At his hearing, Mr. Barr said he recognized that some things have changed over the last quarter century, but he failed to explain how his views on criminal justice have actually evolved. He was more describing what he was seeing this body and others do, but he didn't talk about his own evolution. He didn't say, hey, this was my perspective then, it's changed now. And on the issue of implicit racial bias, I asked him whether he acknowledged its well-documented existence in our criminal justice system. Implicit racial bias, which has been pointed out by people on both sides of the aisle in this body, that has been pointed out by big city police chiefs, former FBI director, and time and time again documented by university study after university study, where it is actually in our Justice Department's policies to train people in implicit racial bias. This isn't something that's new. This is something we understand. But when asked about it, he said, I have not studied the issue of implicit racial bias in our criminal justice system. Therefore, I have not become sufficiently familiar with the issue to say whether such bias exists. I find this incredibly alarming. Widely documented racial disparities throughout our criminal justice system, from police stops to sentencing to charges. Implicit racial bias even in our school-to-prison pipeline, with black kids and white kids, the same infractions in school, with African-American kids more likely to be suspended for them. There is no difference, for example, in blacks and whites in the United States of America, none for using drugs. No difference for blacks or whites or Latinos. We have a drug problem in America, and it's equally seen regardless of race. But yet whites are actually more likely than blacks, in many studies, to deal drugs. Yet despite this, we live in a country where blacks are about 3 times more likely to be arrested for using drugs and almost 4 times more likely to be arrested for selling drugs. And what does that do when you apply a justice system to certain communities and not to others? It has a multiplier effect of impact. It affects voting rights because states still eliminate the right to vote for nonviolent drug charges. It's called felony disenfranchisement. It affects economic opportunity because if you have one criminal conviction for doing things that past presidents have admitted to doing, to members of this body have admitted to doing, then you can't get a job, you can't get business licenses, doors are shut to you, opportunity closed. When you have a justice system that so disproportionately impacts certain Americans, those communities then face serious consequences. As a Villanova study shows, that overall we'd have about 20% less poverty in America if our incarceration rates were the same as our industrial peers. That poverty is more inflicted on those communities of color when they're more likely to be arrested, more likely to be charged, more likely to be convicted because of the existence of implicit racial bias. But the nominee for the top law enforcement position in our country says, I quote, he is not sure whether such bias exists. This should be deeply troubling to all Americans because we believe in an ideal of equal justice under the law. This should be troubling to all Americans because we believe, as King said, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. This should be deeply troubling to all Americans because there is a deep lack of faith that people have in our criminal justice system. They're losing faith that they'll receive equal treatment. And when the justice system does not have faith, it is hampered in doing its most sacred duty. Right now, there is a lack of belief that people be treated fairly, a lack of belief that the system works the way it's supposed to. And Mr. Barr's response and his records show me that he'll do nothing to address these legitimate concerns in communities all across this country. At a time where he could be a leader, a champion, a light of justice and hope for those who have lost hope, for those who have lost faith, those who feel left out and left behind, he almost doubles down with a dangerous lack of knowledge about what we all know exists. If confirmed, Mr. Barr would also be charged with implementing what this body collectively has done to start to reform, for the first time in American history, mass incarceration, increased sentencing. For the first time since 1994's crime bill, we in this body, the wisdom in a bipartisan way, have started to go back to more proportionate sentencing. This body, through the First Step Act, put more justice back in our justice system. It's a first step, but it's the first step in the right direction in decades and decades in our country's history. I'm proud of what we did together, the bipartisan criminal justice reforms that this body just passed into law by an overwhelming vote is incredible, but it is critical that the First Step Act be fully and fairly implemented by the Justice Department. But Mr. Barr has not demonstrated his commitment to the law or to fixing any part of the broken criminal justice system that I've outlined. And then, of course, we have industries, from the private prison industry to phone companies charging exorbitant fees in prisons and jails, making a profit off of these injustices, making a profit off of policies that penalize and criminalize low-income communities and communities of color and that target refugees of color. What's happening in our country's criminal justice system today is a human rights crisis. Think about a justice system right now that has people sitting in prison for months before they even get a trial because they can't afford bail or a lawyer. We have a human rights crisis in this country. We need an attorney general who recognizes a problem and has a willingness to do something about it, not one that says they're not sure we even have a crisis. And an extraordinary challenging time in our history, when this nation was formed under ideals of justice and fairness and equality, formed at a time where we mutually pledge, as it says in our Declaration of Independence, to each other, our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, in a country where we're all in this together, in a country where our values and ideals have to be real for all, not just a select few. After 2 years, we have seen a Justice Department's relentless attacks on basic fundamental rights by a president and attorney general. We now need an attorney general who will work to uphold the values that are most in danger. We need an attorney general who will fight for equal justice for all, not just the privileged few. We need an attorney general who knows the difference between ensuring justice is done and automatically seeking the harshest penalty in every case, with a blind eye to circumstances or fact or extenuating circumstances. We need an attorney general who will stand up for all of our children, LGBTQ rights, for voting rights, for environmental justice and a fairer justice system. We need an attorney general who will refocus on the mission of the Department of Justice in seeking justice for every young person who's afraid to go to school because of prejudice and policies that discriminate. We need one that is seeking justice for every elderly man who lived through Jim Crow only to be blocked from exercising his voting rights because of racially targeted voter ID laws. We need an attorney general who is seeking justice for Americans who have become entrapped in our broken criminal justice system, whether it's a kid from a community like the one I live in who's being targeted by our ineffective drug law, or a kid that's been picked up on the southern border and thrown into a privately run detention center. We need an attorney general that's seeking justice for communities whose soil and air and water are being polluted by massive corporations who feel that no one will fight for them. We need an attorney general who will live up to the purpose of the Justice Department. This is the call of our country. This is the leadership we need. This is the Attorney General we must insist on, one that will seek justice for everyone in every community, from the Gulf Coast to the great states, from sea to shining sea. Mr. Barr has not demonstrated that he understands the urgency, the fierce urgency of this moment in our history, and of the imperative for the Attorney General to be deeply disturbed by injustice and urgently seek justice. For this main reason, I will be voting against his nomination. But if confirmed, I will do my constitutional duty and give oversight and accountability. I will continue to work to ensure that our Justice Department lives up to its demands. And I hope that this Attorney General, should he be confirmed, learns, sees the vulnerable, understands the challenges of the meek, understands the communities in crisis, that he gets to know people, that he reaches out and sits down with folks to learn, to develop a more courageous empathy. But I won't wait on that. I'll fight every day to make sure our Justice Department seeks justice. If Mr. Barr tries to double down on the failures of a broken criminal justice system, to roll back basic rights, or fails to protect voting rights and civil rights, I will fight against his efforts at every step. And I will fight for justice that doesn't just take the side of the powerful few, but seeks justice for every American. That's our obligation, all of us, whether you sit in this body or you sit in communities across this country. We have gotten to where we are because we've all sought justice. Even if it didn't affect our families directly, we knew the call of our country must be about all of us understanding that injustice for one is an injustice for all. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President, in just a matter of hours,